The New York Rangers have said goodbye to several long-tenured players this season, including Jacob Trouba, Kaapo, Kakko, and Filip. And could Ryan Lindgren be next?
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blueshirts fans, to episode number 1245 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can bet $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. And we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, as I mentioned just a second ago there, we've seen the Rangers say goodbye to some pretty long-tenured players, including their captain, Jacob Trouba, and Kaapo, Kakko, and Filip. They've both been here for a while as well. Chytil was, in fact, the third longest tenured player on this team at the time of the trade that brought in JT Miller. But obviously, the Rangers have kind of been bold this season when it comes to saying goodbye to some guys that have had some run here with the Rangers. And it kind of just got me thinking, who might be next? And there's some players that feel like, there's a good to at least decent chance that they'll get traded between now and the trade deadline. Then there's some other players. I know some people are looking at Lafreniere recently and saying to trade him. I won't go that far. Some people might throw out K'Andre Miller as a possibility as well. But to me, the ones that really kind of stick out like a sore thumb are the impending UFAs. And clearly, among the UFAs, the one that stands out the most, at least for me, is Ryan Lindgren. He's been here for quite some time now, been an important part of this team and a part of some deep playoff runs. Obviously, a player that, wears it on his sleeve when he's out there every single night, every single game. But he has struggled this season. There's certainly no doubt about that either. And so what I wanted to do today is just take a little bit of time looking at Ryan Lindgren and debating whether or not the Rangers could, should, and will trade him before the March 7 trade deadline. So what we're going to do first is look at some reasons why I think there's a pretty good chance he will be traded. Then we'll look at some reasons why maybe the Rangers might hesitate a little bit and ultimately not pull the trigger on a Ryan Lindgren trade. And I'm going to kind of have a little bit of a verdict at the end of all this and share my thoughts on what I would do if I was the Ranger GM. But as far as reasons why he might get traded, honestly, I feel like we're at the point where a trade of Ryan Lindgren might make the Rangers a better team. And I hate saying that because we know, look, he's struggled this year badly. His play has slipped, pretty considerably, I think, from even last year to this year. And I think what you're seeing is the wear and tear from the style of play that he goes out there and plays every single night. And, one thing I think all of us Ranger fans should do, you could be upset with his play this year. I mean, there's a lot of Ranger players that you could be upset with how they've done so far this season. But I think we also need to remember that part of the reason for this is probably because this guy is given you every ounce of himself throughout the seasons that he's been here. Every drop of blood, sweat, and tears, he's left it all on the ice for this team. And I think, unfortunately, now he's starting to pay the price for it. So I hate suggesting that it would be like an addition by subtraction kind of a move. But if you do trade Ryan Lindgren, and assuming there's no other NHL defenseman coming back to the Rangers in the trade, that to me would mean that you're probably going to put Zach Jones into the lineup. And we've talked about this off and on this podcast. Those two, Lindgren and Jones, play different styles, but I think overall, Zach Jones is the better overall player right now. He's going to do more to help you win games than Ryan Lindgren will. Maybe the playoffs will be a little bit of a different story because I think Lindgren's skill set translates better to the postseason than Zach Jones might, but we got to get there first. And the Rangers are still, despite everything that happened on Saturday, with the Rangers winning and everybody else in the mix losing, the Rangers still have a heck of a lot of work to do as it pertains to getting into the postseason. But, again, I feel like if Lindgren heads out, you put Zach Jones into the lineup, and I don't think that that's really going to hurt this team too much. Hard to say for sure until we see it in action, but I'm cool with that being a possibility if the Rangers wanted to do that. Now, here's the thing, though. I might feel this way. You might feel this way, that if they go from Lindgren to Jones, that this would make them a better team. I don't believe that the Rangers believe that, though. Because as we've discussed in the past, this team will do anything to keep Zach Jones from being in the lineup. So I don't think the Rangers feel that way, and so maybe that's not as big of a reason why he'll get traded as we might think. But moving right along the list here, another reason that I wrote down as far as why Ryan Lindgren might get traded, why the Rangers might see fit to move on from him before the trade deadline here. There's basically a 0 chance of Ryan Lindgren coming back to the Rangers this upcoming season. I suppose never say never, and in the wacky world of the NHL, crazier things have probably happened, but this is how I felt going into the season when we saw that Lindgren only signed the 1-year extension. And I feel that way now more than I have through the entire campaign, that there's basically no chance that he'll be back. Lindgren this past offseason was an RFA with arbitration rights. It goes back and forth. He was the last free agent to sign with the Rangers, and they finally get a deal done, just before a potential arbitration hearing. And it's a 1-year deal at $4.5 million per season. The Rangers maybe spend a little bit more money on this one season in exchange for not giving Lindgren a whole bunch of years, which in retrospect, it seems like they probably made the correct decision there. Going to 3 or 4 years for Lindgren and having that deal on the books, that probably wouldn't be the best thing for this team at this moment. Now that Lindgren, though, is about to become an impending UFA, or he is an impending UFA, I don't see him coming back to this team on a similar contract, because even if the Rangers said, oh, hey, we'll give you another 1-year deal, same price, come back for one more season, I feel like Lindgren now is a UFA where he controls his own destiny a heck of a lot more than you do as an RFA. He is going to probably want to find a multi-year deal somewhere. I think Ryan Lindgren is going to have a very interesting market if he hits unrestricted free agency this upcoming offseason, which it certainly looks like he will. But it's that situation where you don't want to lose somebody for nothing. Now, it would be a little bit different if the Rangers were pretty much a lock to make the playoffs, because then I think you could go forward with Lindgren this season, knowing that he's going to walk in the offseason and go into the playoffs and do the best that he can, hopefully make another run at it. And then Lindgren has to do what he has to do in the offseason. But the last thing you want to happen here is to not trade him and then miss the playoffs anyway. And then he walks in free agency and you get absolutely nothing for him. And as I was alluding to just a second ago, there is no guarantee whatsoever that the Rangers make the playoffs this season. If anything, it's an uphill battle and probably a less than 50-50 shot. Once again, even after all the good things that happened on Saturday. So there's all that to consider as well if you're the Rangers. I think, especially when you look at their draft capital, the Rangers could certainly stand to add a couple of draft picks in the upcoming season, because the cupboard's gotten pretty bare with some of the moves that the Rangers have made over the last couple of seasons here. And some of the moves I think were certainly justifiable and even good moves, moves that the team arguably, borderline needed to make. But facts are facts. The Rangers have dealt away a lot of draft picks, and if you can get one back by moving Ryan Lindgren, then I think that's something that at least has to be considered, especially when you consider that he will be a UFA at the end of this season. But kind of getting ahead of myself, we're actually going to talk a little bit about the Rangers draft capital in just a second as we look at some reasons why Ryan Lindgren might not get traded by the Rangers before the trade deadline. And then I'll have a verdict about the whole thing at the very end, and we'll do all that good stuff in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Indeed. You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed's sponsored jobs put your post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. Now you can speed up your hiring process with a $75 sponsored job credit. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, Indeed, is all that you need. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. Huge shout out to the everydayers as always. Thank you guys so much for sticking with this podcast throughout all the ups and downs of this season. In our next episode, the plan is to welcome Johnny Lazarus as a guest. So if you have any questions for Johnny, go ahead and shoot me an email. Leave them in the YouTube comment section, whatever it might be. Hopefully we'll have time to take a couple listener questions for Johnny when he joins the show. But for right now, let's go ahead and keep the focus on Ryan Lindgren here and look at some reasons why he might not be traded. And then, like I said, I'm going to have a verdict at the very end of all this. So first of all, I can't even believe I'm saying this, but this is something to consider at this point. the Rangers' feelings. Yeah, I saying that out loud just almost made me cringe. But this is where we're at with this team. You guys have seen this just like I have. This group of players does not tend to respond very well when one of their own gets traded or somewhat semi-mistreated, gets, shown the door in one way or another. They don't like that. They don't respond well to that. We saw that everybody was unhappy in the offseason when Barclay Goodrow was placed on waivers. We saw with Jacob Trouba all the drama that was going on there and just how poorly the Rangers played before, during, and after that trade of Jacob Trouba. There have been a lot of issues this season. I don't know that people were too happy about Kakko being traded either. These guys, I think, tend to take things way too personally. And if you do trade Ryan Lindgren, then you risk kind of sending the Rangers back into this malaise. Now, on one hand, maybe you say, too bad, deal with it. We'll just take our chances. This team has to do whatever it has to do, and we can't be worried about the players' feelings. And I, for the most part, agree, but the Rangers have been playing better lately. I don't want to see it go in the toilet again. That's happened too many times this season. So there's that little part of me that thinks like, oh, well, just hang on to Ryan Lindgren throughout the rest of the season, especially if the return isn't all that great. Which leads me into my next point, the fact that the return in a trade for Ryan Lindgren may not be all that great. It's at least possible that the Rangers, if they look to shop Ryan Lindgren, they might be somewhat underwhelmed by the return packages that teams are offering for him. To begin with, you have to think that probably the teams that are going to be interested in Lindgren would be contending teams. And I think that if you're the Rangers, you'd probably prefer to trade him to the Western Conference. Not that you'd be like terrified of facing Lindgren in the playoffs. And let's be real, the Rangers have a lot of work to do to even get there. So maybe it wouldn't be that much of an issue to trade him to an Eastern Conference team. But I think in the Rangers' perfect world, they'd rather send him to the Western Conference. And a non-contending team isn't going to bring in Ryan Lindgren via a trade unless they're planning to come to some kind of an agreement and re-sign him going forward, because there wouldn't really be much of a point. If a non-contending team acquires him and they're not going to make the playoffs anyway, that makes no sense to give up assets for a player like that. But bottom line, look, I wouldn't trade Ryan Lindgren just to do it, just to make a move. I think that at the very least, this would at least get me talking to an opposing GM. It's got to be at least a third rounder. And, as much as he's scuffled this season, I think Ryan Lindgren might still be able to get you a second rounder, but I don't know that for sure. And the thing that I think hurts Lindgren is that he's had, probably what I would say is his weakest season since he's come into the NHL. And I think a big part of the reason why is all the wear and tear and just the general beatings that he's taken on the ice over the years. And just seems to be aging faster than obviously a lot of other defensemen are going to. But again, like as far as the reason why they might not trade him, it's just that. It's the idea that there might not be that good of a return. And if you're only going to get like a 5th round draft pick for Ryan Lindgren, I say, why even bother? Just go forward with him. Don't upset the apple cart. It's not worth it for a 5th round pick. Go ahead and, ride out the season with Ryan Lindgren. And I feel like he should get you quite a bit more than just a 5th rounder. But the NHL trade market, as we've discussed in the past, can be very, very difficult to gauge. We saw that Tanner Jeannot trade a couple of years ago where the Lightning sent like 5 draft picks and a prospect to Nashville. That was pretty crazy. The fact that the Rangers got a 2nd round pick for Elias Anderson, that was pretty wild a couple of years ago. 1st round pick for Nils Lundqvist. So you just never know for sure. But, again, it all depends on the return. One other thing, another reason why the Rangers might not look to trade Ryan Lindgren, or at least be hesitant to do so, is that I believe, despite all of Lindgren's struggles this season, and clearly there have been plenty, for a while it looked like he was getting it going again, back with Adam Fox. And then the last bunch of games, I don't know, it's kind of been shaky all over again. But I think despite all of this, Ryan Lindgren is something of a heart and soul guy in that locker room, regardless of how he might be struggling this season. And Peter Laviolette pretty much confirmed this not too long ago. It was about a week or two ago, give or take. And Laviolette was asked, because the Rangers were starting to play better at that point, and he was asked, has anybody in the Ranger locker room really kind of stepped up as a leader in the absence of Jacob Trouba, who obviously was traded? And Laviolette, there was some coach speak in there, different guys are stepping up and blah, blah, all that stuff. But the two that he named, that he singled out, were first Ryan Lindgren and second Vincent Trocheck, as far as guys that have stepped up as leaders. This is also before the JT Miller trade for whatever that might be worth. But he did mention those two players. Trocheck wasn't too much of a surprise, and I guess Lindgren's not really either. I mean, he has been there for a good amount of time. And without looking at the roster, I want to say he's one of the older defensemen. I think he's like a year older than Fox. He's definitely older than Miller. He's older than Jones. Borgen, I think, is older than Lindgren. Yeah, he is. Not by a lot, though. And Vakanainen, I'm not sure. I would have to look that one up. But he is becoming, out of nowhere, seemingly, one of the longer tenured Rangers and one of the, sort of the elder statesmen of the blue line, so to speak. So I think for all those reasons, it's at least possible with the Rangers playing better now. Okay, let's not trade this heart and soul guy, this guy that seems very important to that locker room, and let's go forward and just try to get into the playoffs with Ryan Lindgren still here. But the bottom line, Rangers right now have 7 games left between now and the trade deadline. The trade deadline is on March 7th. It's largely in the Rangers' hands as far as what kind of an approach they're going to take at the trade deadline. I think that if the Rangers continue to win games, and they did win 3 out of 4 going into the break there, if they come out and they win 5 of the next 7 games, something like that, then I don't think they're going to be all that active. To be honest, I probably would still trade the impending UFAs. This is where I do my verdict portion of this episode. I think I would still move Ryan Lindgren for all the reasons that I just mentioned. And it pains me to do that. He's been one of my favorite players. But you can get probably, I would say, a second-round draft pick in exchange for Ryan Lindgren. That might seem a little bit high. But again, the NHL trade market can really surprise you. And not that every single team is going to be looking to trade for Ryan Lindgren, but there are 31 other teams in this league. All it takes is one to offer you a second-round pick, and then you can make it happen. You can plug Zach Jones into the lineup, assuming that he doesn't also move in that trade, or he's not a part of some other trade, or whatever it might be. And this is something else, and goes back to something that I mentioned very briefly just a couple minutes ago. The cupboard for the Rangers, a little bit bare right now in terms of draft picks. The Rangers do not have a second-round draft pick in any of the next 3 seasons. And for this upcoming draft, they might not have a first-rounder either. The first-rounder that they gave to the Canucks in the JT Miller trade is top 13 protected, meaning if the Rangers were to draft in the top 13 this year, they would get to hang on to that pick. And then Vancouver would instead get the Rangers' first-round draft pick next year, regardless of where the Rangers end up picking next season. So that's kind of an interesting situation in and of itself. But again, it's pretty bare. It's pretty bare. Bottom line, the way things stand right now, it's either going to happen this year or next year, unless the Rangers make some trades. The Rangers, either this upcoming offseason or the one after that, will have an offseason where they do not have a first or a second-round draft pick. So that's pretty tough, and we'll see what happens between now and then. But again, getting some draft capital back, I don't hate that idea. Sometimes I think draft picks can be a little bit overrated and overvalued, especially if you're the Rangers and you seem to struggle developing a decent amount of your prospects. So maybe for the Rangers, draft picks are even less valuable than they might be for other teams. But be that as it may, again, I think it still makes at least some sense to move Ryan Lindgren for, presumably like a second-round pick. Do I actually think this will happen? That's the other question here. I just gave you my verdict. Do I think the Rangers will do it? Do I think they'll pull the trigger? I actually do. I think that you will see the Rangers between now and the trade deadline move some of these UFAs, continue to retool this roster on the fly. Look, if the Rangers are willing to go out there and trade their captain, Jacob Trouba, and trade Kaapo Kakko, who's been here for, I think it was 6 seasons, trade Filip, the third longest tenured Ranger before the deal happened. If they're willing to move all those guys, I don't think they're going to suddenly get cold feet when it comes to guys like Ryan Lindgren, Jimmy Vesey, Riley Smith. I think there's a very good chance that, I was going to say all 3, maybe at least like 2 out of 3 of those guys will be on the move. I mean, you do have to fill out your roster in one way or another, but I think Lindgren will get dealt and maybe one of the 2 forwards, and then you'll start to see some guys get caught up from the AHL and take those spots in the lineup. I think that's certainly possible. And again, the Rangers have been bold this season. You don't have to agree with everything they've done, and I certainly do not. I think in particular, this last calendar year or so, last year and a half, has been the weakest stretch that Chris Drury has had as the GM of the Rangers. And we've gone through some of the reasons why. I thought that was kind of a weak trade deadline season last year for Drury. And, things did not exactly get handled all that well in the offseason this year, either with a couple of different players. I do think the Ranger players tend to take things too personally, as I mentioned earlier, but Drury's been a little bit shaky. But the one thing that I think you have to say, he hasn't been afraid to to make a big move, to ruffle some feathers, so to speak. Because like I said, he's been shipping guys out left and right, and we'll see if that continues. And again, if they're going to move all those guys, I don't think they're going to suddenly hit the brakes when it comes to Ryan Lindgren. The one thing that could save Lindgren, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that he is a little bit of a heart and soul kind of player for this team. The team's playing better recently. Maybe you don't want to rattle the locker room again with another trade of a guy that's, a beloved veteran and somebody that's been here for quite some time. So a lot to consider there, but we'll see how it goes moving forward. Very, very curious to see how the Rangers play it at the trade deadline this season. There's no clear-cut answer, clear-cut approach this season. Last 3 years, they've always been obvious buyers based on where they are in the standings. That's not really the case this season, but very curious to see how the Rangers end up playing it. In just a second, we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about Erik Brannstrom. He was a defenseman that the Rangers acquired as part of the JT Miller trade. Haven't really had a lot of time to talk about the other players involved in that deal, so we're going to do that now. And like I said, we will talk about Brannstrom in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there is no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, one more thing left to do here for today before we call it is to discuss Erik Brannstrom, a defenseman that the Rangers also acquired as part of the big JT Miller trade. What was it at this point? About 2 weeks ago, week and a half, whatever it was. It's honestly easy to forget that, yes, there were two other players that the Rangers brought in this trade. One, of course, was Brannstrom. The other was Jackson Dorrington. Dorrington, 20 years old, not all that close to making it to the NHL. I want to say he was a former 6th-round draft pick. So kind of just a throw in, it would seem. We will eventually talk about Dorrington. I'll find any information I can. It can be a little bit difficult trying to find info on such late-round draft picks, guys that are kind of unheralded. But we'll get to that in due time in a future episode. For right now, though, I do want to talk about Brannstrom, who does have NHL experience. It feels to me like when it comes to Brannstrom, just in general here, they kind of see him as a little bit of an insurance policy for this season and maybe even more so next season, because a theme that we've kind of gone over multiple times on here is that the Ranger defensemen coming into this season, and this has only gotten more apparent as the season has progressed, a lot of them have uncertain futures with this team. We talked about that going into the year, and even since that happened, Jacob Trouba got traded. I just did a whole section talking about why I think Ryan Lindgren will ultimately get traded. K'Andre Miller could go either way, impending RFA with arbitration rights. Once a significant raise, hasn't really had a great season. Zach Jones always has one foot out the door. That's 4 guys right there. Borgen is signed long-term. So too is Adam Fox. And there are some prospects, but they're not really ready to go. We might see Drew Fortescue next year. That could certainly be intriguing. And on top of everything I just mentioned, one of the defensemen that you maybe would kind of plug and play into one of those spots would have been Victor Mancini. Of course, Mancini was part of the trade that brought in JT Miller, part of this very trade that we're talking about right now. And for the record, I would still do that trade for JT Miller. I think you owe it to yourself to get a big-time, impactful player like that when you can get him on a discount, and that's exactly what the Rangers did. But as far as Brannstrom and his track record is concerned, 25 years old, listed at 5'10", 185 pounds. So certainly there are bigger defensemen in the league than Brannstrom. Former first-round pick by the Vegas Golden Knights in 2017. He went number 15 overall. And a little piece of trivia here. He was actually the 3rd player ever drafted by Vegas. That was their expansion season. He was taken after Cody Glass and Nick Suzuki in that draft class. Never ended up playing for the Knights. He was actually traded to Ottawa to land Mark Stone. But he spent parts of 6 seasons with the Senators. And then this past season, before the trade, 28 games with the Vancouver Canucks and a total of 294 career NHL games for Brannstrom. 10 goals, 67 assists, minus 17 in that time. 367 block shots, only 190 hits. So physicality doesn't seem to be that big of a part of his game. It's hard to know exactly what you have here. I think if you're the Rangers, you're just hoping that he's a late bloomer, simple as that, because he's 25, former first-round pick, has not lived up to the hype to this point. So maybe the Rangers see him as a little bit of a pet project here. I know that Ranger fans, and I've done it too, I include myself in this group, but I know a lot of Ranger fans will get on the team for not being able to develop their prospects, or certainly not be able to develop them to the absolute most of their abilities. It's a little bit better with defensemen than it is with forwards. And there's 3 on the team right now that I think you could point to. Adam Fox, drafted by a different team, but didn't spend any time there. Same thing with Ryan Lindgren. He was traded over to the Rangers before he ever played a game with the Bruins, the team that drafted him. And I know Lindgren has struggled this year, but he's also been a warrior for this team in years past, and somebody that goes out there and wears it all on his sleeve and has been a part of a lot of winning and a lot of success for this Ranger team. And then I would also throw K'Andre Miller in there as well. Again, not having his best season, but for the most part has been a fixture in the top 4 through a lot of very solid, successful seasons for this Ranger team. Even in the past, you can go back another era of hockey, guys like Ryan McDonough, guys like Dan Girardi, guys like Mark Stahl. These are all homegrown players. And again, I know McDonough was drafted by a different team, but he never played for said team, Montreal. So, there's some success stories as far as homegrown Ranger defensemen are concerned. But again, with Brannstrom, you can kind of connect the dots a little bit here as far as why the Rangers traded for him. The uncertainty that the Ranger defensemen have, a lot of them for the future. The fact that there are some prospects that the Rangers have, namely Fortescue and Emery, but they might not be quite there yet as far as being NHL ready. And also the fact that Brannstrom is very, very affordable. He is on a 1-year deal right now, making just $900,000. At the end of this season, he will be a restricted free agent. And I would think the Rangers would look to keep him around as organizational depth. Like I said, just a little bit of a pet project and somebody that you can call up in a pinch. Maybe he could be in a little bit of a 7th defenseman kind of role. Although you might not want that, because if you are trying to, find something that's kind of untapped as it pertains to Brannstrom, then you probably don't want him sitting in the press box every night. You might keep him with the Hartford Wolfpack and see what he can do there. And that's where he is right now. He's played 2 games with the Wolfpack as of this recording. I don't know. To me, it is what it is. It's kind of just a throw-in for this JT Miller trade, but probably as far as throw-ins go, there's probably at least a little bit of upside as it pertains to Brannstrom. And for what it's worth, he did play 8 games with the Canucks in the AHL this year. And for those 8 games, he had 12 points. This is somebody that when he was getting drafted was seen as a big-time two-way defenseman, and it just hasn't come to fruition in the NHL. Like I said, parts of, I believe it was 6 seasons with the Senators and then 24 games this season with the Vancouver Canucks. But I will say his transaction history is somewhat troubling, because after last season, coming into this season, Brannstrom was actually released by the Senators as a pending RFA when he was not tendered a qualifying offer. So the team that, traded Mark Stone and brought in Erik Brannstrom is basically the centerpiece of that trade. He was there for parts of 6 seasons, was Brannstrom, and the Senators basically just gave up. They said enough is enough, and we're going to go in a different direction. Brannstrom then, during this offseason, signed with the Avalanche as a UFA, and then the Avalanche, right at the end of training camp, traded him to the Canucks for Tucker Poolman and a 4th-round draft pick. And then the Canucks, it doesn't stop there. The Canucks immediately put him on waivers. He cleared waivers, so nobody made a move. Nobody used a waiver claim on Brannstrom. He goes straight to the AHL. Now, he was eventually called back up to the Canucks after Derek Forbat left the team for personal reasons and played in 24 games there, like I said, but then traded to the Rangers in this JT Miller trade. So in the span of less than a year, what are we talking here? So the season ends, and June, I think, is when all the transactions start happening. So we're in February now. So in the span of about 8 months, give or take, we've seen Brannstrom basically given up on by 3 different teams. The Senators don't tender him a qualifying offer. The Avalanche then trade him after signing him. They trade him for a 31-year-old that had 163 games of NHL experience and a 4th-round draft pick. And then the Canucks immediately put him on waivers and only called him up, when they obviously had a spot for him. And now, they just basically give him away as sort of a throw-in in this trade. So that's a little bit troubling, the fact that there's 3 different teams in the last 8 months that seemingly just didn't have a place for him, and or were done with him, and or just didn't see him as any kind of a fit for their long-term plans. But again, the hope, I think, is that if you're a Ranger fan, hopefully you can find something that's kind of untapped. It's possible we see Brannstrom on the NHL roster this season. I think, again, if you see Ryan Lindgren and or Zach Jones, maybe even K'Andre Miller, I don't think that'll happen. But if we see one or multiple Ranger defensemen get traded, you have to fill that spot somehow. And Brannstrom might get a look from the Rangers, especially if they're falling out of the playoff chase. Because if that happens, there's no reason not to do it. You might as well give it a shot and just kind of see what you have and try to figure out if you can kind of, unlock some potential that he is obviously yet to find. He had a lot of upside coming into the NHL, 1st-round draft pick, but just hasn't really come to fruition, at least not yet, for Erik Brannstrom. But we'll see what happens going forward with Brannstrom and the Ranger organization. Figure we can call it there. If you guys would like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well, @LO_NY_Rangers. Once again, that's @LO_NY_Rangers. And definitely subscribe to the Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.